I am a board member at First Amendment Voice, and while I'm new to the actual board, I'm not new to the organization. I served for about 3 years as on the advisory board for FAV, and really I'm drawn to the organization for their great work, particularly because they are fiercely nonpartisan in their dedication to encourage all Americans to better understand and exercise their First Amendment rights. So it's a true honor to be a part of the organization and to be with you here today. I have been so excited about this conversation for the past few months, of course, leading up to tomorrow being Veterans Day. So it's such a timely and important topic. And as Haley mentioned, you see it all over the news. It's an important topic. It's newsworthy. It's timely. And I think it's probably not often discussed. In terms of free speech, academic freedom on campuses, and what that experience does look like for military veterans. I myself am a military veteran. I served in the Navy and the Air National Guard. But over the past decade, I've really been dedicated to public education, higher education for the military and civilians, and primarily through museums, public institutions, and what public education looks like. So this is very near and dear to my heart. We're really very fortunate to have with us Alex Morey from a partner organization called FIRE, a great partner to the First Amendment Voice. And FIRE, which stands for Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. And I'll let Alex in just a few moments tell us a little bit more about her and her role and what the mission is of FIRE. And then I think we'll circle back after that, Alex, and sort of tee up, the complexities and sort of the nuances of what it means in general for free speech on campuses and academic freedom, and then that veterans piece of it as well.
Well, I am so happy to be here. Thank you so much to First Amendment Voice for getting this conversation going for us today. Kathleen, it's so exciting to be talking with you. I am, as you said, I'm Alex Morey. I work at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. We were previously the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, and for 20 years, we worked on free speech issues solely on college campuses. Our mission has recently expanded to everywhere in the US. And as anyone with a pulse these days knows, free expression, as you said, is a really hot topic. And we saw a good angle for ourselves to hop off campuses. But of course, we still care a lot about free speech on campuses too. And I head up our campus rights advocacy department. So our team is looking at all the free speech stuff on college campuses, whether it's faculty rights or student rights. And over the years, we have had several very interesting cases involving veterans, some that are, intricately tied to the person's status as a veteran, and some that are a little more attenuated. But as you will see, as we talk about these things, veterans tend to be maybe more knowledgeable about their First Amendment rights than the average Joe or Jane. And they're also more outspoken when it comes to defending those rights. So I'm excited to.
Yeah, no, and to sort of dovetail on that a little bit, you're absolutely right. And I was just thinking about this morning, that, for military veterans, the oath that they take to affirm, right, as they're entering into the military to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, that isn't something that they just abandon for most in the military once they take off the uniform. And so it's sort of ingrained, I think, in who they are. And also, I did want to mention, there is also a trend that we see in the military veteran community. They tend to be, in large, that they vote, they volunteer, they're active in their communities. I think just generally speaking, they can be seen as civically engaged or oriented a little bit more so on average than non-veterans, right? And so again, I think that's what makes this such a compelling topic, is to take this this group and what that looks like when we overlay the academic and freedom of speech on campuses with that. But before we get going, because we do have a lot to talk about, Alex, I don't want to gloss over your expertise and experiences, but I think it's really important of what you're bringing to the table here. I just want everyone to get a fuller picture. Of course, you are an attorney and a journalist, and you defend student and faculty rights blended with a trusted legal strategy and the power of public interest reporting. As you've already mentioned, you're the director of FIRE's Campus Rights Advocacy Program, which is a team of attorneys and advocates who help people of all political and ideological persuasions facing civil liberties threats on American college campuses. Alex is a member of the First Amendment Lawyers Association. She has a JD from the University of Wisconsin Law School, a master's degree in broadcast journalism from Syracuse University's SI Newhouse School of Public Communications, and has trained at the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. You're such a slacker, Alex. I hardly know. It's really impressive, really impressive. Your credentials are just perfect. She attended the University of Arizona in her hometown of Tucson, majoring in journalism and French, graduating with honors. And I love this about you. You were a member of the Peace Corps volunteer in Madagascar, where you taught English in rural and underserved schools. You're licensed to practice law in Washington, D.C., District of Columbia, New York, and Wisconsin. So I feel like that really tees up this great conversation, and I think the framework and background that you can lay out for us so that we can better understand the complexities and the nuances involved. And just for a housekeeping note, this session is being recorded, and we really encourage questions. So as we're walking through these different topics, please do feel free to drop questions into the Q&A. We will reserve those questions for the end, that we will have time to address those, but please feel free to begin to populate any questions you may have in the Q&A function. So with that, I think I'll tee off. Alex, unless you have anything else you want to add at the front.
No, I will say that if anybody is watching this at a later time and you do have questions about anything that's discussed here, or you have something that's come up about free expression anywhere or on college campuses, you can always email me. I'm alex@thefire.org, or you can submit a case to FIRE if you'd like us to look into some kind of violation at thefire.org/alarm. Get it? The fire alarm. Okay, so you can let us know if there's something going on. We're always looking at new issues.
Oh, that's great. Perfect. Okay, so to start things off, I am kind of curious if you can set the scene, perhaps by using an emblematic case of a veteran's right to speak on campus, if there's one that we can use to sort of illustrate and begin this discussion.
Yeah, and I'm going to start to share my screen here, because I do have some visuals that I do think will help us, see the players that are involved. So can you see that well, Kathleen?
Not yet.
Okay, I'm gonna try again. Oh, it's because I didn't hit the right button, and that will do it. Okay, let's try this.
Okay, there we go. We can see it.
Better. Okay. We do have something of a case study. One of our very first cases involving veterans at FIRE was back in 2013 at Modesto Junior College, which is in Northern California. This guy, Rob Van Tynen, is a veteran, and he was a returned veteran at the time. And on Constitution Day in 2013, he attempted to hand out copies of the Constitution on his public university campus. As you may know, and we'll talk about more in a little bit, public campuses are basically entirely free speech zones. So as we'll discuss shortly, Modesto Junior College was trying to get Rob to go into a very small sort of segregated free speech zone if he wanted to talk about the Constitution on Constitution Day. But as we reminded them when we helped Rob sue this campus, that all public campuses are free speech zones. And we can, there's a clip on YouTube that someone took of him talking to this public safety officer who clearly didn't know anything about the First Amendment. I won't show the whole thing, but just a few seconds ought to do the trick.
Anytime anything's being passed out, it's gotta be, you gotta go through the students to go. You know what this is? I understand. Look, hey, I'm not here to fight with you. What are the rules? Why are there rules tied to my free speech? I'm not upset. I'm quite happy, sir. I'm actually having great conversations with my fellow. Thank you. Please go inside and talk to the shop.
So what they told Rob here, and I will stop sharing my screen for just a moment, or can you still see me talking while I have this up? Okay,
Yes.
yeah, so what they told Rob was that he had to go in, be part of a registered student organization, get approval from his university. And that's, of course, not what the law says about students expressing themselves on campuses and even non-students. So most of all public university campuses are considered areas for free speech, at least the open outdoor areas. Now, sometimes colleges can make exceptions for example, the primo areas on campus, like right in front of the student union or something like that. But most of the sidewalks, like where Rob was, are free speech zones. So to give you the recap of what happened here, he ended up suing his college and the college settled with him. They said, oops, really sorry. They promised to teach their administrators about the First Amendment and change the policies so that no students that wanted to express themselves, even on something as basic as here's a copy of the Constitution, it's Constitution Day, could do that outside of like small remote free speech zones. So as you could see there too, Rob was super articulate and knowledgeable about his free speech rights and was sticking up for them. We unfortunately sometimes see people when they're approached by authorities or university officials who have power over them or the police, they just sort of fold and do whatever that person says. But what was great about Rob is he knew exactly what his rights were and he knew that they were being violated. So that was pretty cool to see. And of course, we can talk more about what speech is protected on college campuses.
No, that's great. And one, I think you made mention in that about, being a public university, but can you kind of back up and just maybe help us frame this? If there are different rights at public colleges and universities versus private?
Yeah, there definitely are. So on public college campuses, the First Amendment applies in full. So that means that the rights that you would have as a public citizen speaking on a sidewalk or in a park apply just the same on a public college campus. Now, of course, there are some nuances, like if you're in a professor's classroom, they have their own academic freedom right to control the classroom. You can't just get up in the middle of class and start protesting because that would be super disruptive. But in the we say in the forums that are open for people to speak, like the middle of the quad or outside of most buildings, you can protest, you can approach students and say, hey, you want to join my club or talk about these things. And schools can't stop you from doing that. We do see a lot of administrators who are, for the most part, not knowledgeable about these rights, or sometimes bad actors try to tell students, like they told Rob, you have to go to a special faraway place to have free speech, or you have to register, or you have to get pre-approval, or, the list goes on. And so the basic rule is that in most places, in most open areas of campuses, the First Amendment applies with full force at public schools. And that's because public schools are the government. Public schools are effectively arms of the government. And as I'll mention in a second, the First Amendment says that the government cannot regulate speech that it disapproves of. It has to allow free speech. And so to the extent that a public college, an arm of the government, is trying to do that, that's a no-no. So what the First Amendment does say, just as a refresher, is that Congress, the government, can make no law restricting freedom of speech. It also covers religion, assembly, freedom of the press, which is very closely tied to speech. So student journalists who are veterans, or student journalists generally, you also have full First Amendment rights. And of course, petition. I don't talk about it here, but we had a really interesting, people always forget about petition. We had a really cool case involving a ROTC guy. I don't know that he was necessarily had been fully enlisted or anything, but he was real mad that he got a parking ticket at the University of Rhode Island, and he wrote to the parking people and said, screw this ticket, this is BS or whatever. And the parking people tried to get him in big trouble. And he has the right to petition a government official, even using, very strong language. He didn't violate any law. It was totally First Amendment protected. So you forget about that right to petition. But you can do it strongly. So again, here are the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment. And the one we're going to be talking about today is speech. And I do also have, well, I guess first I'll talk, before I show the First Amendment in action, I will talk about private colleges. So most private colleges make First Amendment-like promises, especially the real good ones. There are many, for example, religious colleges or some of the military academies that prioritize other values over free expression. We don't bug them as long as they're clear. So Brigham Young says, whatever Mormon God says is #1 here, and you don't have free speech rights. We don't bother BYU because they're clear about it. Or many of the military academies say, we've got other priorities here above free speech. We don't bother them either. But it's the schools that say, students on this campus have full free expression rights. If they then try to tamp down on something a student or faculty member says, we just point to those policies and say, usually under contract law theory, you have to deliver on what it is that you're promising.
Right. And I'd love to make mention really quickly, not to sidetrack you, on FIRE's website. I loved it. I was scrolling through and punching into some different colleges and universities. Can you help explain for people? There's a lot of great resources on the FIRE's website, but one of them is that you rate, right? I think it's the green, yellow, or red for different college campuses and universities in terms of how you see them and their approach to freedom of speech. If you can just maybe tell us a little bit about that, because it's a fantastic resource.
Yeah, so we have, we're at thefire.org, and you can take a peek at all the things that we have. And I should mention too, just like First Amendment Voice, we are fiercely nonpartisan. So I always try to say that up front, but we definitely have a couple different kinds of ranking systems that we use to evaluate how well colleges and universities are doing. We try to encourage students and their parents to know before they go. Sometimes we don't hear from students until they're already in trouble. And sometimes they're in a school where they don't actually have free speech rights. So it's really good to know your rights. We have a ranking system for schools' policies specifically that we rank on a traffic light system. So green means go, their policies are great for free speech. Yellow means, hold on a second. Some of these policies look okay on their face, but they might be able to be applied in an abusive way. So maybe they contain subjective terms or terms that are ill-defined that an administrator can say like, oh, this is offensive to me, so you're in trouble. And then red light schools have policies where the policies as written are blatantly unconstitutional. And we usually make an effort to engage with those schools and say, hey, you've got to be changing those policies. Sometimes we sue over them. For many years, we just wrote strongly worded letters. And then we realized like, hey, sometimes when universities get sued and they have to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars, they actually respond quicker. So we do have several kinds of rankings. We also have a more recent student free speech rankings where students told us how, and we'll talk about some data that we got from that, that poll in a little bit, but where students were able to tell us how they felt speaking on their campus, whether they thought administrators. Yeah, so it's really cool. So lots of good stuff on our website. And then, so I just wanted to, one of the ways that I like to talk about the First Amendment is by showing you the edges of what the First Amendment protects. So visuals are a good way to do that. So here is a great photo. Everybody's outfits in this picture are protected speech. And you may have different feelings, very strong feelings about the clothes in this photo, but without, any kind of violence threatened or discrimination or harassment, just wearing these clothes is protected expression. Here's one that might feel yucky to veterans. I'm a military wife, by the way. My husband's recently retired Navy Reserve. He would probably not like seeing this, but in the US, you can burn a flag in expressive protest. So this was common during, for example, the Vietnam War, when people really objected to what the government was doing. And the Supreme Court has found that burning an American flag to protest the government, right? We have the right to petition the government. We have the right to engage in political expression. That's the core of our free speech rights. This is protected. A variety of protests are protected speech. For a long time, speech by people in, marginalized communities, people tried to shut that down. These days, it's very clearly protected. We hear from college students that one of the most difficult things, or some of the most difficult things to talk about, include race, recently COVID-19, politics. Abortion is one thing that college students find controversial. So this is protected speech, being pro-life. And on campuses, you can say, fuck the patriarchy. You can shout your abortion. For a while, that was popular. All of these, expressive, all of this expression on various sides of the spectrum, all protected by the First Amendment. Gestures like this both of these are protected by the First Amendment. Again, if you cross the line into like threatening someone or moving aggressively toward them, that might be protected. But, just giving someone the finger or doing the symbol that guy is doing, protected expression. And again, I'm showing you speech on the edges of First Amendment protection that many people, most people find offensive, but that's nonetheless protected. And that's going to help us understand some of the cases that we talk about in a little bit. One of the things that we hear a lot these days is hate speech isn't protected. You can't engage in hate speech. And I want to correct that for people who might have been misinformed. So hate speech does not actually have a legal definition. And that's, of course, because hate speech to one person is another person's dearly held belief, and vice versa. So I like to show this photo illustrating the, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, depending on who you ask, which of these people is engaging in hate speech. And of course, we see that in our, present, in US society, for example, surrounding one of the hot topics these days is critical race theory. Should you be allowed to teach critical race theory? Or should you be allowed to have books about, transgender kids or abortion or divorce in libraries? And for some people, it's super important to speak out on those issues, and other people find it hateful and offensive. And so both sides, especially with the CRT stuff, have been trying to pass laws saying no hate speech. And the other person says, well, CRT is hate speech because it's anti-white. And then the other people say, no, that's hate speech because it's anti-minority. And so you can see how laws against hate speech are really impossible to apply fairly, because there are really obscure and impossible definitions.
Right.
That said, we'll talk about that. Doesn't mean that all speech is protected, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Here's a fun one. When petitioning the government, again, speech on the edges of protected. This guy, William Barboza, in 2012 was driving through the town of Liberty, New York, and he got a speeding ticket. And when he paid his ticket, he took this document and added an addendum there that showed his displeasure with the fact that he got a ticket. My favorite part is that he crossed out the word liberty in New York and wrote tyranny instead. He got arrested for this, and it went through the courts, and a federal court found that this is protected by the First Amendment. You can tell your government that you disagree with a decision that they made, even if it hurts the police officer's feelings or whoever's at taking in ticket payments that day. I do love Esquire reported on this, and it said, this is perfectly acceptable. Thanks, First Amendment. Everybody, it's a polarized time, but everybody hates speeding tickets and parking tickets. So that's one thing that I have learned we can all come together about here in America. So it's what the founding fathers would have wanted. God bless America. And then finally, of course, military related speech. fuck the draft. There was an important Supreme Court case, Cohen versus California, where a guy in the during the Vietnam War wore a jacket that said fuck the draft across it, and he got arrested for disorderly conduct, and the Supreme Court said, you know what, where he was trying to express himself, and you could roll out a long scroll about reasons why you disagree with the military, but rhetorically, is that as powerful as just wearing a jacket or saying fuck the draft? And the Supreme Court has held that, not really. You can be angry when you speak. You can speak in an uncivil way. You can sometimes be hateful, and that's okay, because that's the way we protect public discourse on campuses. Okay, so other veterans cases. I think because we're talking about veterans today, I want to showcase some of the other situations that veterans have, gotten themselves into and out of on campuses. So an interesting one at Temple University, this resulted in a really landmark court case about the rights of people to dissent on college campuses, even at private universities. So Christian Dijon served in Bosnia. He was in the army. He talked about, and he also was enrolled in a graduate program, a master's program at Temple University. He had to take some leave to serve. And he said one of the ways that he got himself into this sort of tiff with Temple was that while he was in Bosnia, he started getting emails from Temple that he disagreed with, that were sort of anti-First Amendment. And so that kind of got him, he didn't want to attend a flag burning. So again, these are protected things, but Christian said, I don't want to attend a flag burning. I'm in a combat zone right now. He says that's how a lot of it started. And then in his master's program, he started being really outspoken about stuff that he disagreed with. He was sort of not on the same political page as a lot of people in his program, which of course is protected by Temple's a private university, but they make sort of First Amendment-like free speech promises. And so what ended up happening was he got on the wrong side of his professor, and his professor started basically treating him really differently, downgrading his papers. And what all the evidence showed was that it was because of his political views. So it ended up, we'll go back in just a second, but it ended up, he ended up suing over a speech code. When we talk about those green, yellow, and red type speech codes, Temple had one that he was punished under that basically said he was, engaging in harassment type behavior, but it was really over broad and his speech should have been protected. And so what was kind of a bummer for Christian is that the court found that this policy was unlawful. However, they could not, for a variety of legal reasons, they couldn't force Temple to give this guy his degree. So he had like a ton of loans, and he had already gone through, he had basically completed his thesis, but Temple refused to grant it. Mm-hmm. Happy story though, in the end, we did some reporting on this story, and eventually another university granted him a degree and offered him a teaching job. So happy ending for Christian, but one that it took like a decade to get this all sorted out. At a public college, Lieutenant Colonel Ajax Paris, interesting guy. He was in the Air Force. He does a lot of interesting research on on history, the military, gay rights. He's a gay man, and he talks about he does a lot of teaching at the intersection of those issues. He got himself in trouble, and again, UCLA is a public university. He got himself in trouble for reading aloud from Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail. So of course, Martin Luther King Jr., key figure in the civil rights movement, his letter from Birmingham jail contains the N-word. And so Professor Paris, who's a white guy, got in big trouble and was, initially punished by the university by way of an investigation for reading from that letter. he's now at another school and teaching. So I guess another happy ending there, but we see a lot of cases like that at a number of schools, but he's our veteran that got in hot water there. More recently, this is Ash Mickelson, a Navy veteran, I believe. They use they, them pronouns. They were a student at Kansas City Art Institute and got expelled for retweeting hentai, which is like an anime sexual art form. And the school said, you know, this is obscene. And we wrote to them and said, actually, obscenity has a very strict definition. Obscenity is like basically like hardcore pornography with no artistic value whatsoever. And of course, this student is retweeting art. So even if this type of sexual art is not your cup of tea, again, totally protected by Kansas City Art Institute's First Amendment-like promises. And I think I've got one more here. Another cool guy, Richard Taylor, another veteran. He was a professor at St. John's in New York, and he also got accused of racism for asking students to do a hypothetical about the slave trade, specifically something called the Columbian Exchange, basically talking about how how goods and services were exchanged through countries, and asking students, you know, is it possible to justify the slave trade? Were there any good things that came out of the slave trade in terms of economics? He wasn't necessarily justifying slavery. He was just asking students to think critically about it. And one of the interesting things about Richard Taylor is that, you know, he, if you look at his like professor ratings and stuff, he talks a lot about his military career, and students have praised him for making quote unquote like really dry military material super engaging and interesting. And so that was a bummer when this guy was for a while taken out of class.
Yeah.
Okay. Final veteran that we'll talk about is everyone's favorite veteran. Did you know Ice-T, the man, the myth, is a veteran? He is a fan of fire too. And apparently, you know, he was, well, I'll let him tell his story, but he has strong views on censorship. And he's outspoken about it, maybe because, you know, he had experience fighting for his rights as a veteran. We'll watch this now.
Freedom of speech. We don't have to like what we hear, but we all have the right to express ourselves. I made the first record ever sticker because they said, yo, we need parental guidance to know that these records might be a little vulgar to some, but I was just expressing myself the way I talk. Silencing artists doesn't make our society any better or safer. That's why it's so important to have groups like FIRE out there defending free speech, because free speech makes free people.
And I agree with that, of course.
That's
Free-
a good tagline, free speech makes free people.
I know, right? And I
That's
wish,
great.
I'm like, how come I didn't get invited to this video shoot? I would love to be with Ice-T. But yeah, so those are our, you know, our veteran cases, and going along with what Mr. T said there. You know, one man's vulgarity is another man's lyric. And of course, this is, you know, talking about what the government can censor. I don't want to be misconstrued about the fact that, of course, people can, you know, can criticize speech. They can use their own First Amendment or free speech at private colleges right to criticize faculty or students that they disagree with. But what we're talking about here is whether the government or a private institution that promises, you know, First Amendment-like promises can, you know, render institutional punishment against somebody for their protected expression. And the Supreme Court has said, no way. So interesting, very interesting legal landscape here. I would love to give you a chance if you have any questions to ask them.
Well, yeah, I'm just curious, you know, and again, you've hinted at, you know, hate speech is a very difficult thing to define, especially legally, but, you know, there's bound to be, and if you can help us understand the parameters, right, because it's certainly not an anything goes. And so if you can talk about a little bit about, you know, what are those parameters, right? And how would that play out, and how would a campus deal with that type of situation?
Yes, I can, if I can share my screen again here. I've been locked out. Let me try this again. Okay. Yeah, so definitely it is true that not all speech is protected. And sometimes people, come at me and are like, Alex, you just think people should be able to like threaten each other. And I say, oh no. Oops, that was not what I wanted to do. Not all speech is protected, for sure. In fact, there are several very well defined categories of speech that are not protected. And now I think, can you see that?
Not yet.
Oh, okay, try again. Okay. I'm like a millennial, so I always like to use that as an excuse. How about now?
Yep, got it. Yep.
I'm just a millennial in a Gen Z world here. Okay, so the First Amendment does not protect all speech. Let's not get it twisted. Just because, quote unquote, hate speech is protected, there are some very well-defined categories of speech that are not. So true threats and intimidation. That doesn't mean that if somebody says like, hey, you're a jerk, or says something that you don't like, that's not necessarily a threat. We sort of see this definition creep happening where students are saying like speech is violence, or if you say something I don't like, that threatens my existence. Well, true threats and intimidation have very specific legal definitions. So a true threat usually has to include a serious expression of an intent to commit violence that's targeted at someone. So if somebody just says, I don't like you, that's not going to cut it. Or even like, I don't like gay people, or I don't like white people. That's not a threat because they're not threatening violence, and they're not necessarily targeting it at a specific person or group. They're just making generalizations. You might not like it, you might think it's hate speech, but it's not a true threat. Same with intimidation, similar parameters. Other ones we see frequently misconstrued these days are harassment. So in the educational context, in a case called Davis versus Monroe, the Supreme Court laid out the standard for peer-on-peer harassment. So what does it take for a student to harass another student? And it requires conduct that can include speech, but it has to be severe, pervasive, objectively offensive, and so serious that it deprives the student victim of access to the educational resources at the university. So again, someone's, off-color tweet, or something a professor says in class that you don't necessarily like, or something a student says if they're, ribbing you about whatever is your dearly held belief, that's not going to meet this severe, pervasive standard that is required for harassment. And again, when the Supreme Court is making these considerations, it is doing so against the background of the fact that our society really prizes freedom of expression, even though it sometimes causes people to be upset. Precisely because it causes people to be upset, right? That's how we make change in our society, is very passionately arguing for what we believe. Same with incitement. Incitement means you're telling people to go commit a crime right now, and it has to be likely to occur. We saw this somewhat recently at schools like Penn State. There was a recent protest there where students were very upset, and one of the speakers that the students were protesting walked through the crowd and was kind of like joking with the students and riling them up. And some of the administrators and police officers, when they canceled that speech and disbanded the protest, said, well, that person walking through was inciting violence. No, incitement would have required that guy not to just walk through and, cause people to be upset, but he would have had to say like, hey, you guys better go, beat these other protesters up right now, that sort of thing. Obscenity, we talked about that. Hardcore porn, if you're just, sharing art that is maybe a little too sexy or racy for some people, that's not going to cut it. Child pornography, of course, not protected. And then other speech integral to criminal conduct. So you can't defame people. You can't commit fraud. You can't extort people. You can't say, you know, I'm going to blackmail you and call it free speech. We talked about defamation or perjury. You can't lie in court. So those are the standards for unprotected speech. And it's so important for people to know that they can't do these things. And FIRE is not going to help you if you are threatening people or if you're harassing people. But you, on the flip side, you can't call something harassment that's free speech and expect the government, your public institution, to punish it if it's not actually illegal or unlawful conduct.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
again, just to recap, the First Amendment does protect speech that doesn't fall into any of those categories. Speech that people don't agree on, like quote unquote offensive or hate speech. One thing we see often these days is quote unquote problematic speech. That's problematic. Well, it may be to some people, but under First Amendment standards, it's okay. And also violent speech. There was actually today at Cornell, Ann Coulter wanted to talk. She was invited by a student group, and some other students interrupted her talk and were screaming at her, you know, your speech is violence. We don't want that here. Well, you know, speech is not the same as violent, at least not by violence, at least not by legal standards. So there's the line on what speech is legal and not.
Mhm. Well, and this may be a good, it's kind of a two-parter. If you can give us just a quick sort of summation about, you know, why campuses are such an important place for free expression. I think that's just a really good thing to put in place. And then I want to also, after that, after having an understanding, you know, talk about sort of the digital impact, right, on social media and these other things. I know there have been some interesting, even over the weekend, reports coming out, and specifically about college students and their hesitation to engage in dialogue, because on the far extremes on both sides, it's so vitriolic and caustic. It's minimizing people's comfort level of engaging in any kind of civic dialogue. So anyway, but first, maybe just give us an understanding of why campuses are such an important place to pay attention to in terms of free speech.
Yeah, so these are really important questions, and I'm gonna get to all of them. So we talked a little bit about the critical race theory stuff. I will go past this. This is the hate speech stuff, and we might come back to that. But so what is special about college campuses? The Supreme Court has talked a lot about why college campuses in particular are so integral to not just, you know, upholding the First Amendment, but really to our democracy. So this guy's Paul Sweezy. He got in trouble for not, he didn't want to rat on his fellow potential communists back there. I'm not saying he's a communist, but he was asked by his university, you know, you need to rat on your friends here and tell us if they're communists so we can punish them. And in this case, 1957, the Supreme Court upheld academic freedom in really strong terms. They said to impose any straitjacket on the intellectual leaders in our colleges and universities would imperil the future of the nation. So again, we go back to what we were talking about, like, for example, Ajax Paris, reading from Martin Luther King's letter, or the guy at St. John's who wanted to talk about slavery in a way that some people found was offensive. The Supreme Court has said, look, that's up to faculty to decide, and administrators or people in the public who aren't the experts don't get to decide. Of course, there are some limits on what faculty can do or say when it comes to, you know, what are best practices in their field, but that should be decided by a fair panel of other faculty. For example, you can't just have administrators saying, you have to tell us this, or you have to say this in class, or you can't say this in class. Likewise, students are also, this is the case that Healy versus James back in 1972, the Vietnam War was going on. This is the case where the Supreme Court said the First Amendment applies in full on public college campuses. So this student group, Students for a Democratic Society, they sound great, but they had been linked to some, like a more national group that had been engaged in like civil disobedience, violence, I think they were blowing places up, not this particular chapter of the group, but the national group. And of course, we have similar controversies going on right now on campuses with groups, for example, like Turning Point USA or YAF and YAL, which are affiliated with some conservative or libertarian groups that a lot of other students who maybe lean more liberal on campuses don't like. And so often those groups, you know, student governments are saying, you're not going to get recognized on our campus because, you know, Turning Point USA is associated with problematic ideologies. Well, back in 1972, the Supreme Court said, Students for a Democratic Society has a right to be on this campus. They can assemble, they can speak, even if there are concerns about the ideology of the group, because of course, on college campuses, the vigilant protection of constitutional freedoms is nowhere more vital. So we've got faculty rights, we've got student rights. Another fun one when we talk about offensive expression. So this was a really interesting case out of Missouri. There was a graduate student who was distributing leaflets or student newspapers that were, I think she had printed them herself, and they were really fringe. So I think one of the headlines in this paper was like "motherfucker acquitted," and they were talking about stuff that they were, you know, anti-Vietnam War type stuff. And she was punished. Again, the Supreme Court says the mere dissemination of ideas, just talking about ideas, no matter how offensive to good taste, on a state university campus may not be shut off in the name alone of conventions of decency. So this is getting a resurgence now when students are saying that's offensive, this is problematic, that's hate speech, we need people to be civil with each other. No, we don't. And the Supreme Court has said as much, especially on a college campus. You want the fringe ideas. You want people saying stuff that maybe are there authentic views that you disagree with, because on a college campus, you can bring your own views. You can bring quote unquote better views, and they, you know, these ideas duke it out in the marketplace of ideas.
Right.
As one of my colleagues says, as the president of FIRE says, as sort of the lab in the looking glass, when you are scrutinizing what are the best ideas, you want all the ideas there so that you're not missing something, because of course groupthink is a big issue. And then finally, this was a dissenting opinion by Justice Marshall when we talk about students shouting down speakers. We've seen a recent very troubling uptick this semester in students shouting down speakers, what we call the heckler's veto on campus, or engaging in violence as a way to get a university or college to cancel a speech on campus out of, you know, quote unquote safety concerns. And in this, in the Kleindienst case, Justice Marshall, who was dissenting, said, you know, the freedom to speak and the freedom to hear are inseparable. They're two sides of the same coin. So of course, when students like the ones at Cornell just this week get up and say, you know, your words aren't welcome here, they're violence, they are not lawfully exercising their right to peacefully protest, which of course they have, but instead by shutting down this speech, they are violating listeners' rights to hear. So you have a First Amendment right to hear things, you know, on public campuses or private ones that promise free expression. So the Supreme Court has definitely talked about these things. And in terms of, you know, what kind of data we have to show us this, I talked a little bit about what students are saying in terms of their ability to talk on campuses and beyond. And some of our recent research shows that it's dicey out there. So we always ask, you know, if not on a college campus, where else can we debate tough topics? But students are saying that speaking in an authentic way is difficult to do. So you talked a bit about our spotlight on speech codes ratings, where we talk about different policies that schools might have. We've also recently, just this year, and I think the last couple of years, we've asked students, what's it like at your college? Do you really feel like you can, you know, disagree with a professor or say what you want without worrying about your reputation? And students have some troubling responses. So self-censorship is pervasive. I can believe this because I sometimes self-censor. I'm a First Amendment lawyer, and sometimes I go like, dang, I shouldn't send that tweet because people are going to be mad at me. Or, I get nauseated trying to phrase something just right because I know I'm going to get criticism because I've got an opinion that is not popular. And students say they feel this pressure on their campus. 63%. So a strong majority say they're worried about damaging their reputation because someone misunderstood something that they said or did. Frequently, we see this in the social media space. Someone fires off a tweet or films a TikTok that is, maybe doesn't necessarily express every single thing that the student wanted to say, and that gets misconstrued. An equal percentage said shouting down a campus speaker was acceptable to some degree. So again, we've got a majority of people saying they're worried to speak, and a majority of people saying that it's okay to silence people who want to speak. So not great for a free speech culture on campus. Conservative students, well represented among, military veterans. My husband, for example, is more conservative than I am. We have discussions about this stuff all the time, but conservatives feel like they are less able to express their opinions. And 40% of students would be uncomfortable disagreeing with a professor in public or in a written assignment. We often have students coming to us saying, like, I'm worried that my professor is downgrading me because they want me to say that I sort of believe in their views in a way that I don't really. Faculty have the right to set their curriculum and say, here's the right answer, but they can't cross the line into forcing students to say, like, I believe in, we have a lot of students saying, like, my professor wants me to say that I believe in this, quote unquote, woke ideology, and I don't, or whatever. And so lots of interesting data to bolster that contention that we see a lot. And then the three most difficult topics that students have told us recently on campus are abortion, racial inequality, and then when we took this survey, it was closer to the pandemic.
Sure, yeah.
COVID-19.
It was on people's minds. That is really, really helpful as a backdrop. We do have I know we're getting short on time, and we do have a few questions.
Great.
One of which relates to, what we're just talking about, right? People not feeling comfortable voicing their opinions. Do we have any data, or do you have any data in terms of the veteran student population? Is that seen at the same rates in the veteran student populations as in the general students, or do we not just have that data?
So that's a great question. I do not know that we have asked that particular question, but anecdotally, what we tend to see is that, what I have seen is that students who have, experience as veterans, are veterans, or in the military, while they're in school, do tend to know their rights more, right, and do tend to be more poised to and interested in fighting for them. They don't, they don't sit down when they're told that they can't say something, which is, which is great. There is definitely, particularly among faculty members who don't have tenure protections, for example, when adjuncts get in trouble, they're under a ton of pressure to just kind of fold and do whatever the school wants them to do. But as we've seen, with Ajax Paris and Richard Taylor, they have definitely fought for their rights.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. I mean, I think we'll just see more and more, the education benefits for military veterans are thankfully strong. And so organizations that are really active, like Student Veterans Association of America, they're, gosh, I don't know, maybe 800,000, 800,000 strong across the US and some outside of CONUS. So yeah, I mean, it would be great to get some real hard metrics with that as well moving forward if possible.
Yeah, I will definitely tell FIRE that we need to add that to our questions.
Maybe next Veterans Day, we can have the same conversation.
That's right. And it would be really interesting to look at sort of different groups like, military or non-traditional students in other ways, older
Yeah,
students or younger
absolutely.
students,
Yeah.
what are their different views, different generations like Gen Z or millennials
Yeah,
or
absolutely. Does
yeah,
the
that
life
would be cool.
experience translate? Yeah, no, that's really fascinating. Okay, we've probably got more questions here than we have time, but one, how do free speech advocates reconcile taxes going toward public education, but parents not wanting certain material being taught to their kids? I don't know, this may not be at the college university level, and so I don't know if you want to speak to that, if that's something that you.
Well, what I can say, and now that FIRE has expanded a bit, we have definitely waded into many of those controversies. So our stance, like for example, I'll just give an example, like we are suing Florida over the Stop Woke Act. So if you might be familiar, given that you're asking this question, the Stop Woke Act is a law in Florida that prevents teachers from teaching some topics related to racism if it makes basically white people feel bad about their race. And we have objected to that because it violates teachers' right to teach as they see fit, or school districts' right to teach as they see fit, specifically at the college level. So academic freedom in colleges is very robust, and faculty members have a very broad right to teach as they see fit. But if the state of Florida makes it illegal to, for example, teach about slavery, we see some like to teach about, for example, history related to slavery, if it makes some people feel bad, which, I think it would make a lot of people feel bad to hear about what happened, that could run them afoul of the state law regarding that. So we have taken up, a First Amendment case and said, faculty specifically should have the right to teach as they see fit without state interference, because again, the government is not allowed to make laws that threaten freedom of speech, and we think the Stop Woke Act does. So that's sort of a roundabout way of answering your question, but
that's great. Okay, one more question, if you can entertain it. I love this one because it gets at all these points, but it's also military veteran centric. Says, I think you mentioned that the military academies, might not be treated the same or less scrutiny as other public institutions in terms of First Amendment expression. Can you elaborate on that? Do students under federal contract for military service have limitations as to the First Amendment rights? And of course, there's a whole UCMJ and all these other things in there, but if you can maybe answer that.
Yes, so great question. So when I talk about some of the military academies, what I mean is that at some military academies, we'll take West Point. They are very clear that when you matriculate at West Point, whatever it is that the military, your military obligations are sort of paramount, and they are very clear that you don't have the same free speech rights in furtherance of their ability to, ask certain things of you as a military member, or in furtherance of your military training. Free speech is further down on their list of priorities, in the same way that some religious schools, for example, will say, we're a Christian college, and the biblical truth is paramount here at Saint whatever college. And so they're very clear that students cannot really express themselves freely unless it's in line with those values. Now, if you go to like a public school as a member of the military, you should have all the same First Amendment rights that any other student would get, to the extent that if you are like under a current military contract, you may be further restricted by that particular contract, is sort of a separate legal issue than what you might be allowed to say under the First Amendment. But so from First Amendment standards, you should be allowed to say whatever. It may be possible that you've also made a separate agreement with the military to, I don't know, not wear your uniform when you're like on campus and off duty or something like that. And they could probably enforce that.
Yeah. Great. Okay. So I know we're short on time. This has been extremely helpful. I know I have learned a lot. So thank you for the conversation and the great questions from the audience. If you can, Alex, leave us maybe with what we can do, right? Whether you're a veteran or not, to ensure that we're helping to contribute to sort of a freer climate where people do feel free to express themselves. What can we all do?
Yeah. So a couple things. So first and foremost, know your rights, whether you're at a public college or just a regular old citizen, not in college anymore, or at a private college, know what it is that you're allowed to do on your campus, and then exercise those rights. So if you are passionate about something, as many military folks are, speak out and try to do it without too much fear. There's a huge culture of fear right now, a huge culture of self-censorship. I am always trying to push against that, even with myself. It's scary to hear loud voices that disagree with you. And it's a lot easier to just say, I'm going to tap out of this conversation. But if you're really passionate about something, don't be afraid, write op-eds, speak up in class, go to a protest, but don't try to censor other people. So if someone's speaking on campus that you disagree with, don't try to shout them down. Don't try to disrupt them, because that only undermines your expressive rights, right? Because your right to protest is the exact same as their right to speak. And so if we respect that core right, then we can have a productive dialogue about whatever is the issue of the day. And one of my favorite thought experiments is like if you wanted to make a perfect law that would stop people from saying stuff you disagreed with, but would only allow, like hate speech, for example, you want to stop people from saying hate speech and it would only allow speech that you like. Okay, you can craft that law. Now put that law in the hands of your least favorite politician. And think about what they would consider offensive speech or hate speech. And then it's a much more grim reality. So the better option is to tolerate speech on a range of issues so that we can have productive discussions and so that your own free speech rights aren't infringed.
That's perfect. And that's a nice segue to make a plug for First Amendment Voice, one of their programs. Key programs is the Difficult Conversations. And exactly that. There's so many different challenging things, but it's important to keep the conversations going and not to shut out or marginalize or self do it to yourself. Likewise. So, well, thank you, Alex, and thank you everyone who's tuned in and who will tune in for everything that you do to uphold, right, all of the ideals that are so critical to our democracy, and to the veterans, of course, who signed up to fight to ensure that we have those ideals as well. So thank you, guys. If anybody has any questions, Alex gave her contact information up front, and you can reach out anytime to myself or any member of the First Amendment Voice, and we're happy to continue the conversation. All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kathleen. It's been a pleasure. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you. Take care.